Hello, everyone, and welcome to Merryvale. I'm Andrew Wright, the winemaker from Merryvale Vineyards, alongside Jeff Crawford, Starmount winemaker. Here with you today to talk about two of our kind of newest releases that are really Merryvale Syrah from the historic Malbec from Stagecoach vintages, and I think something a little more interesting to drink that's not typically Cab Franc, Merlot from the Napa Valley, something that can kind of express a different kind of flavor going on here. So without further ado, let's talk about the Syrah. And Jeff, it's nice to have you here today because you made the Syrah, as you will recall, in 2018 off of the historic Stanley Ranch from our grapes down there. So why don't you tell us about the Syrah?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I've been making Syrah off the Stanley Ranch estate since 2013. Single vineyard. It's kind of evolved stylistically over the years. One of the things that has remained constant was I did co-ferment a little bit of Viognier.
Awesome.
With the Syrah, which is pretty historical as far as Northern Rhone co-fermentation. It's interesting, a little factoid about that. It was believed that part of the reason why that started was co-fermentation of the Syrah with the Viognier. Although Viognier is a white grape, would actually make the Syrah darker. Science came along, did some research. Turns out that there was an enzyme in the skin of Viognier. So whole cluster Viognier was key. Enzyme in the skin of Viognier that would actually help extract color from the Syrah. So
Awesome.
Science finally caught up with what was actually happening traditionally. So another kind of interesting thing about this, I never had problems getting fruit character off of the grapes from Stanley Ranch, but one of the things I love about Syrah is that kind of meaty, reductive quality, and so to try to coax a little bit more of that character out of the blend, I started not racking at all, leaving it on primary lees for all 18 months in barrel before racking finally to the final blend right before bottling, and I felt like that helped kind of really develop that kind of more brooding, reductive character that I love in Syrah. So still a relatively kind of cool climate Syrah style. Maybe not extreme, but kind of maybe in between, like Sonoma Coast versus like Paso Syrah or something like that. I don't know. I like it. I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
I think it's great. I mean, thinking about this wine in tank before we bottled it, and to your point, your first racking, it was so overwhelming to me aromatically, and it was so like almost massive. And after a couple of years in bottle, I have to say it's drinking amazingly well right now. And to your point about cool climate, I really love the freshness and the balanced acidity. It definitely is matched by, I think, kind of like the darker core, that kind of gamey, meaty core that you're referring to. But I really love kind of the subtle nuances and the balance, and it's almost like it's a light big wine, if that makes sense. I mean, I think if people like Pinot, but maybe don't like how light Pinot is, but Cab is kind of too big for them, Napa Cab. I mean, this is like right, kind of threads that needle really perfectly.
Yeah, interesting point. I like the different kind of layers that it gives. You get a little bit of that geranium, you get a little bit of those kind of juicy fruit notes, but then at the same time, there is that kind of brooding, reductive gaminess to it as well. Maybe even an herbal element. I don't know. The longer it stays in the glass, the more it kind of develops and shows itself more and more, I feel.
It's American Cornas, so everybody should just buy cases and cases of it. Really. Moving on to, well, I guess we should talk a little bit about the 18 vintage before we could go into the Malbec.
Yeah, good.
18 vintage, coming on the back of a string of drought years, was a lot more, I think, forgiving. It was a more even growing season. Not like 17, where you had those huge high heat spikes towards the end of the vintage. It's kind of allowed us to kind of take our time in the vineyard and pick when things were perfectly ripe. So just a really lovely, I think, aromatically interesting and complex, but at the same time balanced vintage. I find it's not an overwrought, overly powerful drought year vintage. It's kind of, everything's kind of right where it needs to be in terms of classic, I feel like, Napa winemaking. Classic California winemaking, I should say, as well. And so speaking of like classic California winemaking, this next wine, the Malbec, is one of our favorites, and it comes from Stagecoach Vineyards. So people will be familiar, or maybe not familiar with Stagecoach, but Stagecoach is one of the most famous vineyards in Napa Valley, up on Atlas Peak. So down further to the south of the valley, we're in St. Helena here in Merryvale. Down in the southeastern end of the valley, up on the mountain there, volcanic rocky soils. You have the western-facing exposures. You have the elevation changes, and then you have Malbec, which is not a single varietal wine that's made really very often in Napa Valley or at all outside of Argentina, or Cahors, of course, if you're in France. But to dovetail off of your point about meatiness and gaminess, I feel like drinking these two side by side is really great because Malbec to me is like the more broody cousin to this Syrah in a certain way. It's got a little bit more of the broad-shouldered approach that a Bordeaux would take. It's a little bit more powerful, but at the same time, it does have a rusticity, a gamey meatiness, almost like a bloodiness, which sounds pejorative, but I mean that in the highest complimentary way. And it really, I think, highlights and works well with the rocky soils. I get a lot of minerality out of it, too. This does have a little bit of Cabernet Franc from St. Helena, from Stan Vineyard, as well as some Merlot from Farella. So great pedigree to this bottle. And I think it's just really interesting because it's all of the same Bordeaux varietals, but kind of turned on their head, inverted away. So like sometimes people will put 3% of their Malbec into their Cabernet Sauvignon blend. This is 90% Malbec. So it's kind of a cool wine.
Yeah, definitely. As far as comparing the two side by side, this is darker, richer, definitely more powerful, but at the same time approachable. 18 was that type of vintage for me. I agree. That was one of the things about the 18 vintage that really drew me to it. I felt like it had that unique balance of power and elegance.
For sure.
That is something that as a winemaker we constantly chase. And I feel like we have that in this vintage, and the Malbec definitely shows that as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just a little bit about the oak program. This is about 50% new oak on this Malbec, so it's ready to drink now, but it also could lay down for a few years and just improve as it ages. I'm not sure about your oak program, but it seems like it's pretty kind of neutral-ish.
25% new
Yeah.
oak on this, but
Awesome.
but at the same time more kind of lighter toast.
Yeah.
It's really to just kind of add a little bit of that spicy layer, but at the same time definitely not trying to weight anything down. Almost more trying to give a power through the oak tannins as opposed to the heavily toasted. I don't want this Syrah to get marshmallowy, So trying to kind of bridge that gap a little bit with the oak program.
I feel like you nailed it. It's really good. And the Malbec I really like as well. So go to the website and join the wine club and buy these wines and drink them and enjoy them as much as we do.
It's a deal. Cheers.